Everyone told Helen to give up. "He'll come home when he's ready," they said. Dogs grieve too. But it had been 4 months. 4 months of Duke lying on that grave, rain or shine, snow or heat. 4 months of Helen driving to the cemetery every single day, carrying food he wouldn't eat and hope she couldn't hold. Her brother was gone. The whole town had watched them lower the casket. The whole town had said their goodbyes. But Duke hadn't. And on a cold November night, when Helen knelt beside him one last time, ready to admit defeat, Duke's entire body changed. His ears shot forward, his tail went rigid, his eyes locked onto the grave with an intensity that sent chills racing down her spine. Then he started digging. Not frantically, not wildly, but with purpose, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Helen grabbed his collar. "Duke, stop!" But then she heard it, faint, desperate, a voice from below the ground, and it was calling her brother's name. The first time Helen saw Duke refuse to leave, she thought it was temporary. The funeral had ended hours before, the last mourners trailing away in quiet clusters, their black umbrellas dotting the gray October landscape like crows. She'd stood by the grave long after everyone else had gone, one hand resting on the mound of fresh earth, the other clutching a tissue she'd shredded without realizing. Duke sat beside her, silent and still. His golden fur was damp from the drizzle, his brown eyes fixed unwaveringly on the grave marker. When Helen finally turned to leave, her legs heavy with exhaustion and grief, Duke didn't follow. "Come on, boy," she'd said softly, tugging gently on his collar. He didn't budge. She tried again, this time with more force, but Duke planted his paws firmly in the grass. His body went rigid, every muscle locked in place. It wasn't defiance. It was something else, something deeper. "Duke, please," Helen whispered, her voice breaking. "He's gone." But Duke's gaze never wavered. He lowered himself slowly onto the damp ground, curling his body against the headstone as if trying to keep it warm, as if waiting for someone to come home. Helen stood there for a long time, watching him. Finally, with tears streaming down her face, she walked away alone. That was day 1. By day 3, Duke still hadn't moved. Helen returned every morning before work, carrying a thermos of coffee and a bag of dog food. She'd sit beside him on the cold ground, talking quietly about nothing and everything. The weather, the bills piling up, how empty the house felt without James. Duke never responded. He simply lay there, his breathing slow and steady, his eyes fixed on the grave. The groundskeeper, an older man named Frank with kind eyes and weathered hands, started leaving water bowls near the grave. "I've seen dogs grieve before," he told Helen one morning. "But this one, he's different. It's like he's keeping watch." Helen nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. By the end of the first week, word had spread through town. People began stopping by, leaving small offerings, a blanket, a stuffed toy, notes tied to flowers. "For the loyal dog," one read. "A true friend," said another. Local news picked up the story on day 12. A young reporter with a camera crew showed up at dawn, filming Duke from a respectful distance. The segment aired that evening. "Loyal dog refuses to leave owner's grave," the headline read. The footage showed Duke lying peacefully against the headstone, his fur ruffled by wind, his expression somewhere between sadness and determination. Helen watched it alone in her living room, James's favorite armchair still positioned exactly where he'd left it. She cried until she had nothing left. The calls started coming after that. Strangers offering condolences, dog behaviorists suggesting techniques to coax Duke home. One woman even offered to adopt him, thinking Helen couldn't care for him properly. Helen hung up without responding. Duke wasn't her dog. He was James's, and if Duke believed James was still there, who was she to tell him otherwise? By day 30, a routine had formed. Helen arrived at the cemetery every morning at 6:30, before the sun fully rose. She'd sit with Duke for an hour, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in shared silence. She brought fresh food and water daily, though Duke rarely touched either. His body had grown thinner, his ribs starting to show through his coat. The vet made a house call on day 35. Dr. Brennan was a woman in her 50s with steady hands and a no-nonsense demeanor. She examined Duke carefully, running her hands along his sides, checking his eyes and gums. "He's losing weight," she said quietly. "His vitals are stable for now, but if this continues, we're looking at serious health risks." "What do I do?" Helen asked, her voice barely audible. Dr. Brennan hesitated. "You could force him to leave, physically remove him and keep him confined until he adjusts. But honestly, given the state he's in, I'm not sure that wouldn't do more harm than good. Some animals, they bond so deeply that separation feels like death itself." Helen looked at Duke, who hadn't acknowledged either of them. "So I just watch him fade away? Or you trust that he knows something we don't?" The words hung in the cold air long after Dr. Brennan left. By day 45, the weather had turned. November brought frost that clung to the gravestones like lace, and mornings began with Helen scraping ice off her windshield. She started bringing thicker blankets, wrapping Duke in layers he tolerated but didn't seem to notice. Visitors still came. A schoolteacher brought her students to talk about loyalty and love. An elderly couple left a framed photo of their own dog who'd passed. A veteran saluted the grave and whispered something Helen couldn't hear. Duke acknowledged none of them. His world had narrowed to a single 0.6 feet below the final surface. On day 52, Helen brought her laptop and worked from the cemetery. She sat on a folding chair beside Duke, typing emails and taking calls while he kept his vigil. Her boss had been understanding at first, but patience was wearing thin. "You can't keep doing this," her co-worker Sandra said during a video call. "It's not healthy." "He's all I have left of James," Helen replied. "He's a dog, Helen, and he's dying." Helen closed the laptop without responding. That night she dreamed of James. He was standing in the cemetery, smiling that crooked smile he'd had since childhood. Duke sat beside him, tail wagging, whole and healthy and happy. "Take care of him," James said. "I'm trying," Helen whispered. "Not Duke," James replied, his smile fading. "Me." She woke with tears on her pillow and the dream already slipping away. Day 60 arrived with the first real snowfall. Fat flakes drifted down in silence, blanketing the cemetery in white. Helen arrived to find Duke completely covered, just a small mound of snow with a golden tail barely visible. She brushed him off gently, her hands shaking. His fur was cold to the touch, his breathing shallow but steady. "Please," she whispered. "Please come home." Duke's eyes opened slowly. For the first time in weeks, he looked at her. Really looked at her. His gaze held something Helen couldn't name. Not recognition exactly, but acknowledgement. As if he heard her but couldn't obey. Then his eyes slid back to the grave, and the moment passed. The town's support began to wane around day 70. The news cycle had moved on. Visitors became less frequent. Even Frank, the groundskeeper, started avoiding eye contact when Helen arrived. "I'm sorry," he said one morning, his voice gruff. "But the cemetery board is asking questions. They're worried about precedent. Other folks might start leaving dogs here, thinking it's allowed." "Are they going to make me remove him?" Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Not yet. But they're talking about it. Helen nodded numbly. She'd known this was coming. Everything temporary eventually ended. That night, she made a decision. If Duke wouldn't come home, she'd stay with him. She packed a sleeping bag, extra blankets, a camping stove. She told her boss she was taking a leave of absence. She called Sandra and asked her to check the mail. "You've lost your mind," Sandra said, but her voice was gentle. "Maybe," Helen replied, "but I can't let him die alone." She set up camp on day 73, positioning her tent just far enough from the grave to give Duke space, but close enough to keep watch. The first night was brutal. The temperature dropped below freezing, and the thin tent walls did little to keep out the cold. But Duke seemed to sense her presence. His breathing grew slightly steadier. His body relaxed, just a fraction. And for Helen, that was enough. Days blurred together after that. 75, 80, 90. Helen lost track of time, measuring her existence in sunrises and the slow passage of seasons. Snow piled higher. Her fingers went numb despite gloves. Her back ached from sleeping on frozen ground. But Duke remained. And so did she. On day 95, a stranger appeared. An older woman with silver hair and a face lined with years of living. She stood at a distance, watching Duke with an expression Helen couldn't read. "May I?" the woman asked, gesturing toward the grave. Helen nodded. The woman approached slowly, kneeling beside Duke. She didn't touch him, just studied him with quiet intensity. "I had a dog like this once," she said after a long silence. "After my husband died, she wouldn't leave his closet, slept there for months, surrounded by his clothes. Everyone said it was unhealthy, that I should move on, help her move on. But I didn't. I let her grieve the way she needed to." "How long did it take?" Helen asked. The woman smiled sadly. "She died in that closet, 6 months to the day after he passed. The vet said her heart just gave out. But I don't think that's what killed her. I think she simply decided she'd waited long enough." Helen's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," the woman replied, standing. "She died where she wanted to be. With him, even if only in memory. That's more than most of us get." She walked away before Helen could respond. That night, Helen lay in her tent, staring at the canvas ceiling. The woman's words echoed in her mind. Duke was dying. She'd known it for weeks. His body was failing, his spirit tethered to something beyond this world. But what if he was right? What if there was something here, something none of them could see or understand? What if his loyalty wasn't just grief, but knowledge? She fell asleep with the question still unanswered. Day 100 arrived quietly. Helen marked it by placing a small bouquet of wildflowers on James's grave. Duke sniffed them briefly, the first interest he'd shown in anything other than the grave itself. 3 months, boy, Helen whispered. "You've been here 3 months." Duke's tail twitched. Just once. But it was the first voluntary movement she'd seen in weeks. Something was changing. She could feel it in the air, in the way Duke's body seemed more alert despite his weakness, as if he was waiting for something specific, something imminent. On day 110, the first real sign appeared. Helen was dozing in her tent when she heard Duke bark. Not a weak, tired sound, but sharp and urgent. She scrambled outside to find him standing. Actually standing. His legs trembled with effort, but he was upright, his nose pointed at the grave, his entire body rigid with attention. "Duke!" Helen approached slowly. "What is it?" He barked again, then began to pace. Short, deliberate circles around the headstone. His eyes never left the ground. Helen's heart raced. This was different. This wasn't grief or stubbornness. This was alert. This was purpose. She knelt, beside the grave, pressing her ear to the cold earth. Nothing. Just silence and the distant sound of wind through bare trees. Duke paced faster. "I don't understand," Helen whispered. "What do you hear?" But Duke couldn't answer. He could only wait. And so Helen waited with him. Day 115 brought the first real cold snap. The temperature plummeted overnight, frost covering everything in a crystalline shell. Helen woke to find her water bottles frozen solid, her breath visible even inside the tent. Duke lay against the headstone, his body shaking despite the blankets Helen had piled over him. His breathing came in short, shallow gasps. "That's it," Helen said firmly. "I'm taking you home, right now, no arguments." She reached for his collar, but Duke's eyes snapped open. The look he gave her froze her in place. It wasn't defiance or stubbornness. It was desperation. Pure, raw desperation. "Please," his eyes seemed to say. "Not yet. Just a little longer." Helen's hands dropped. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I trust you." That night she lay awake in her tent, listening to Duke's labored breathing. She'd made her peace with the possibility that he might die here, that she might wake one morning to find him still and cold. His vigil finally ended. But some part of her, the part that had stayed these 115 days, believed Duke knew something she didn't, that his loyalty wasn't blind or broken, that he was waiting for a reason. She just hoped he'd live long enough to see it. On day 117, the weather broke. The temperature rose just enough to melt the top layer of frost, leaving the ground damp and soft. Helen arrived at her usual time, arms loaded with supplies, to find Duke sitting upright. Not lying down. Sitting. His posture alert, his ears forward, his eyes locked on the grave with an intensity she'd never seen before. "Duke?" She dropped the supplies and ran to him. He didn't acknowledge her. His gaze never wavered. His breathing had changed, becoming deeper, more controlled, as if he was listening to something beyond human hearing. Helen knelt beside him, her heart pounding. "What is it, boy? What do you hear?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the two of them kneeling in the cold dawn, the cemetery silent around them. Then Duke's entire body went rigid. His ears shot forward, his tail went stiff as a board, and he started digging. Not frantically, not wildly, but with purpose. His paws moved in steady, deliberate motions, throwing dirt behind him in controlled bursts, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment, as if he'd known all along that this day would come. "Duke, stop!" Helen grabbed his collar, pulling him back. But then she heard it. Faint. Desperate. Muffled by earth and wood and 4 months of silence. A voice. A voice calling out a single word. "Duke." Helen's blood turned to ice. Her hands released Duke's collar as her mind struggled to process what her ears had just heard. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. James was dead. The whole town had watched them lower his casket into the ground. The funeral director had shown her the death certificate. Cardiac arrest, it had said. Sudden and irreversible. But that voice. Duke barked once, sharp and urgent, and resumed digging. His paws moved faster now, throwing clods of dirt in every direction. His breathing came in harsh pants, but he didn't slow down. Helen's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. Her fingers felt numb, disconnected from her body. She dialed 911, her eyes never leaving the grave. 911, what's your emergency?" "I'm at Riverside Cemetery," Helen said, her voice barely recognizable. "Section C, plot 47. I think there's someone alive in one of the graves." Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, "Ma'am, can you repeat that?" "There's someone alive in my brother's grave. I can hear him. The dog can hear him. Please, you have to send someone now." "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. We're dispatching units to your location. Can you tell me exactly what you heard?" Helen's throat tightened. "I heard my brother calling his dog's name, from under the ground." The operator's voice remained professionally neutral, but Helen could hear the skepticism. "Units are on their way. Please stay on the line." Duke's digging had exposed several inches of earth now, revealing the darker soil beneath. His claws scraped against something solid, the edge of the concrete burial vault. Helen dropped the phone and fell to her knees beside him. If there was any chance, any possibility that James was down there, she couldn't waste time waiting. She began digging with her bare hands. The earth was cold and damp, clinging to her fingers and packing beneath her nails. Duke worked beside her, their combined efforts creating a shallow depression in the grave. Helen's mind raced with impossible questions. How could anyone survive 4 months underground, without food, without water, without air? But the voice had been real. She'd heard it. Duke had heard it first. They dug until Helen's hands bled, until Duke's paws were raw and muddy. The concrete vault was visible now, a gray rectangle that looked exactly like what it was. The lid of a tomb. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Within minutes, the cemetery filled with flashing lights. Police cars, fire trucks, an ambulance. Officers swarmed the area, their faces a mixture of concern and confusion. "Ma'am, step back," one of them ordered, reaching for Helen's arm. "No," she said fiercely, yanking away. "My brother is down there. We heard him." The officer exchanged looks with his partner. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but—" "Listen!" Helen shouted. She pressed her ear to the concrete, ignoring the cold seeping through her clothes. James, if you can hear me, make a sound." Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Helen could feel their judgment, their pity. They thought she'd lost her mind. Then, from below, a sound. Faint but unmistakable. 3 deliberate thumps against the underside of the concrete. Every person standing there heard it. The officer's radio crackled to life. "Get the excavation equipment here now, and call the medical examiner. We need to confirm what we're dealing with." Within 20 minutes, a small excavator arrived. Workers in high-visibility vests moved with careful precision, removing dirt in controlled layers. The concrete vault was exposed fully now, its corners sharp and clean despite months underground. Helen stood back with Duke pressed against her legs, his body trembling. She couldn't tell if it was from exhaustion, cold, or anticipation. Maybe all 3. "This doesn't make sense," the fire chief muttered, studying the vault. "Even if someone were alive down there, they'd have suffocated within hours, days at most." "Just open it," Helen said. The workers attached chains to the vault's lifting points. The excavator's engine roared as it slowly raised the heavy concrete lid. Inch by inch, it lifted, revealing darkness beneath. The moment the seal broke, a rush of stale air escaped. Someone gasped. Several officers stepped back. But Helen moved forward. The casket beneath was intact, its polished surface dulled by condensation. But there, pressed against the viewing panel, was a handprint. Fresh. The glass was fogged from breath. "Get it open," Helen whispered. "Now." The fire chief didn't argue. 2 workers moved forward with crowbars, working carefully to pry open the casket's seal. The mechanism resisted, designed to stay closed, but eventually yielded with a groan of stressed metal. The lid opened. and James Parker, who had been dead for 117 days, gasped for air. His eyes were wild, unfocused. His skin was deathly pale, his lips cracked and bleeding. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost dangerous amounts of weight. But his chest rose and fell. His heart beat. He was alive. The paramedics surged forward, their training overriding their shock. They lifted James from the casket with careful efficiency, laying him on a stretcher and immediately starting IV lines. Helen couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what her eyes were showing her. Duke had no such hesitation. He lunged forward, breaking free from Helen's numb grip, and pressed his nose against James's hand. The hand that had fed him, walked him, loved him for 3 years. James's fingers twitched. His eyes, struggling to focus, found Duke's face. His cracked lips moved, forming a single word. "Good boy." Then he passed out. The ambulance screamed through town, lights flashing, sirens wailing. Helen rode in back, holding James's hand while paramedics worked around her. Duke sat pressed against her legs, his eyes never leaving James's face. "How?" Helen whispered to the lead paramedic. "How is this possible?" The woman shook her head, her expression grim. "I have no idea. His vitals are weak but stable. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, possible organ damage, but he's breathing. His heart is beating. Beyond that, I can't explain it." At the hospital, James was rushed into emergency care. Doctors and nurses swarmed, their faces reflecting the same shock Helen felt. She was ushered to a waiting room, Duke somehow allowed to stay with her despite hospital policy. They sat together in plastic chairs, both covered in dirt and blood, and the impossible reality of what had just happened. Hours passed. The sun rose fully, morning light streaming through the waiting room windows. Helen stared at her hands, still caked with grave dirt, and tried to make sense of the senseless. Finally, a doctor emerged. He looked exhausted, his scrubs rumpled, his expression unreadable. "He's stable," the doctor said without preamble. "Barely. His kidneys are severely compromised, he's dangerously dehydrated, and he's lost nearly 30% of his body weight. But he's alive." "How?" Helen asked for the 100th time. The doctor sat down heavily. "There are cases, extremely rare, of people entering catatonic states that mimic death. Reduced breathing, almost no pulse, body temperature drops. It's called pseudo-thanatos. With the right conditions, the body can slow its functions to almost nothing. Almost hibernation." "For 4 months?" "That's what doesn't make sense. The longest documented case lasted maybe 2 weeks. This is unprecedented." He rubbed his eyes. "There's something else. We found evidence that the casket's seal wasn't perfect. A small gap, barely noticeable, probably a manufacturing defect. It allowed minimal air exchange. Not enough for normal breathing, but in a catatonic state, with metabolism slowed to almost nothing. It might have been just enough." Helen felt her chest tighten. So if the seal had been perfect, he would have died within days. It was pure chance, 1 in a million. "It wasn't chance," Helen said quietly, looking at Duke. "He knew. Somehow he knew." The doctor didn't argue. Over the following weeks, the story exploded. News crews from around the world descended on the small town. Scientists debated the medical impossibility. Religious leaders called it a miracle. Skeptics demanded investigations. But for Helen, none of that mattered. James recovered slowly. His kidneys healed. His weight returned. The color came back to his face. And when he was finally strong enough to tell his story, it was simpler than anyone expected. He remembered the funeral, remembered lying in the casket, unable to move, unable to speak, his mind trapped in a body that had betrayed him. He'd heard the prayers, felt the casket being lowered, listened to the first shovelfuls of dirt hitting the lid. He'd felt terror beyond description. But then, in the darkness and silence, he'd felt something else. A presence, not supernatural, not ghostly, just the certain knowledge that he wasn't alone. He could hear Duke, faintly at first, then clearer. The sound of paws on earth above him, the rhythm of breathing, the warmth of loyalty that transcended wood and soil and stone. And James had held on. Day after day, his body in its strange state of suspension, his mind clinging to that single thread of connection. He'd known, with absolute certainty, that Duke wouldn't leave. That as long as his dog kept watch, there was still hope. On the day they finally brought James home, 4 months and 23 days after his funeral, Duke was waiting on the porch. He'd recovered from his ordeal, his weight returned, his fur shiny and healthy. When James stepped out of Helen's car, Duke simply stood. His tail wagged slowly, his eyes bright and clear. They met in the middle of the lawn, man and dog, two souls bound by something deeper than words could express. James knelt, his arms around Duke's neck, his face buried in golden fur. He whispered something Helen couldn't hear. A thank you, maybe, or a promise, or perhaps just a recognition of what they'd both always known. That loyalty isn't measured in days or months. It's measured in the choice to stay when everyone else leaves, to believe when belief seems impossible, to wait even when waiting might cost everything. Duke had made that choice, and in doing so, he'd saved a life everyone else had already mourned. That night, Helen sat on her porch, watching James and Duke walk slowly through the yard. James still moved carefully, his body not quite ready for normal life. But his smile was real, his laughter genuine. Duke walked beside him, close enough that James's hand rested naturally on his head. Their pace matched perfectly, two halves of a whole that had been temporarily broken, but never truly separated. Helen thought about the last 4 months. The cold nights, the doubt, the grief. The moment she'd almost given up. The moment Duke had refused to. She thought about all the people who'd told her to let go, to move on, to accept reality. But Duke had known a different reality, one that humans, in their logic and reason, couldn't see. Sometimes the impossible was just patience wearing a different face. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Helen heard James's voice carrying across the yard. "Want to sleep inside tonight, boy?" She couldn't see Duke's response, but she heard James laugh. A moment later, they both appeared at the porch, Duke's tail wagging, James's hand still resting on his head. "He says he'll think about it," James said, his eyes twinkling. Helen smiled. "Take your time, both of you." They settled into chairs, the three of them watching darkness fall. The cemetery was miles away now, but Helen knew they'd visit tomorrow, to thank the groundskeeper, to leave flowers, to say a different kind of goodbye to the grave that had almost become real. But for tonight, they were home, together. A family reunited by the stubbornness of love and the unwavering faith of a dog who'd refused to believe the impossible. The days that followed carried their own strange rhythm. Helen moved back into the house, her camping gear stored away but not forgotten. James slept most of the time, his body still recovering from an ordeal no human should have survived. Duke rarely left his side, positioning himself on the floor beside James's bed, like a guardian who'd learned his lesson about letting his human out of sight. Dr. Brennan, the vet who'd examined Duke at the cemetery weeks ago, stopped by on the 3rd day. She brought treats Duke actually showed interest in, and a thick medical file she'd been compiling. I've been consulting with colleagues, she said, settling into the kitchen chair Helen offered. Animal behaviorists, neurologists, even a few researchers who study animal cognition. Everyone agrees Duke's behavior was extraordinary, but nobody can fully explain it. What do you mean? Helen asked, pouring coffee. Dr. Brennan pulled out several printed articles. Dogs can detect certain medical conditions. They can smell cancer, sense oncoming seizures, predict cardiac events. Their olfactory system is 10,000 times more sensitive than ours. But this was different. James wasn't just sick or in distress. He was in a state of near death, sealed in a casket under 6 feet of earth. So how did Duke know? That's what we can't answer. The prevailing theory is that James's condition, this pseudo-thanatos, still produced some form of biomarker, a scent, a sound, something that leaked through that defective seal, something so faint that no human instrument could detect it. But Duke could. Helen thought about those 4 months. All those days Duke had lain motionless, his focus absolute. He wasn't just grieving, he was monitoring. Exactly, like a medical alert dog, but for a condition we didn't know existed. And here's the remarkable part. The stress of maintaining that vigil should have killed him. The malnutrition, the exposure, the emotional toll. By all accounts, Duke should have died weeks ago. But he didn't. No, because he had purpose. Animals with purpose, with a clear mission, can endure things that would break them otherwise. Duke's purpose was keeping watch over James. And he fulfilled it. After Dr. Brennan left, Helen sat with the research papers spread across the kitchen table. One phrase kept appearing in the academic language. Unprecedented bonding phenomenon. Scientists could measure Duke's devotion in cortisol levels and behavioral patterns, but they couldn't explain the why of it. The depth of connection that made one soul refuse to believe another was gone. The media attention intensified as James grew stronger. News crews requested interviews daily. A documentary filmmaker wanted exclusive access. A publisher offered a book deal. Helen refused them all. This wasn't a story for strangers to consume. It was their life, fragile and hard-won, and they needed space to understand it themselves. But she couldn't stop the town's reaction. People they'd never met dropped off casseroles and cards. The cemetery became something of a pilgrimage site, though Frank the groundskeeper did his best to keep curious visitors at bay. Someone even started a GoFundMe for James's medical bills, which quickly raised more than they needed. "We're famous," James said one afternoon, scrolling through his phone from the couch. Duke's head rested on his lap, the dog's eyes tracking James's every movement. "There are memes about us, dog loyalty memes." Helen smiled despite herself. "How do you feel about that?" James set the phone down and stroked Duke's ears. "Weird. Everyone's calling it a miracle, but it doesn't feel miraculous. It just feels like Duke being Duke, like this is what he was always going to do. The doctors say you shouldn't be alive." "I know. I heard them talking when they thought I was asleep. Impossible, they kept saying. Medically impossible." He was quiet for a moment. "But I remember something, from when I was down there. Not the whole time, just pieces. And I remember being aware of Duke, not hearing him exactly, but feeling him. Like his presence was an anchor keeping me from drifting away completely." "Do you think you would have survived without him?" James didn't hesitate. "No, I'd have let go, given up. But I could feel him waiting, and I couldn't leave him there. Does that make sense?" Helen nodded, her throat tight. It made perfect sense. Love worked both ways. James had held on for Duke just as Duke had held on for James. The medical community remained baffled. Dr. Harrison, James's primary physician, published a case study that carefully avoided the word miracle, but couldn't hide his astonishment. Colleagues from around the world reached out with questions he couldn't answer. How had James's body sustained itself for so long? The tiny air gap explained oxygen, barely. But metabolic function? Waste processing? Brain activity? Every answer raised 10 new questions. "You're going to be in textbooks," Dr. Harrison told James during a follow-up appointment. "Medical students will study your case for decades." "Lucky me," James replied dryly. "I mean it. This could change how we understand catatonic states, death determination, even consciousness itself. You were clinically dead by every standard measurement. Yet some part of you was still there, still aware. That's profound." But James seemed less interested in the scientific implications than in the simple fact that he was home. He spent his days slowly rebuilding strength, taking short walks with Duke, sitting on the porch, watching the world move past. He spoke little about the 4 months underground, and Helen learned not to push. The nightmares started in the 3rd week. Helen would wake to the sound of James's ragged breathing, sometimes his muffled cries. She'd find him sitting upright in bed, Duke pressed against him, tremors running through both their bodies. "I'm sorry," James would say. "I didn't mean to wake you." "Don't apologize. Do you want to talk about it?" He always shook his head. But one night, after a particularly bad episode, he finally spoke. "It's the darkness. In the dreams, I'm back there and I can hear Duke, but I can't get to him. I'm trying to dig up, to break through, but my body won't move. And I'm afraid that if I can't reach him, if I can't let him know I'm okay, he'll die there waiting for me." Helen sat on the edge of the bed. Duke had repositioned himself, so his body pressed against James from shoulder to hip, a warm barrier between James and his memories. "Duke knows you're here," Helen said softly. "Look at him. He's not worried anymore." James looked down at the golden retriever who'd saved his life. Duke's eyes were half closed, his breathing even and deep. Content. At peace. "Yeah," James whispered. "You're right." The nightmares gradually decreased in frequency, though they never fully stopped. Some traumas, Helen understood, left marks too deep to fully erase. But they learned to manage them together, the 3 of them a unit bound by extraordinary circumstances. By the 6th week, James was strong enough for visitors beyond immediate family. His best friend Marcus drove in from 2 states away, bursting through the door with tears streaming down his face. "You're alive," Marcus kept repeating, crushing James in a hug that made Helen wince. "You're actually alive. I went to your funeral, man. I gave a eulogy. I cried in front of everybody." "Sorry about that," James said, his own eyes wet. They sat up late that night, Marcus demanding every detail. James told him what he could, the strange half-consciousness, the sense of Duke's presence, the impossible weight. Marcus listened with an expression that cycled between awe and disbelief. "This is insane," he finally said. "Like, genuinely insane. And Duke, he just sat there for 4 months?" "Every single day," Helen confirmed. Marcus looked at the dog, who'd remained near James throughout the entire conversation. Can I pet him?" "He's not a sacred relic," James laughed. "He's just Duke." But when Marcus reached out, his hand trembling slightly, it was with the reverence usually reserved for something holy. Duke accepted the attention with patient dignity, as if understanding that his story had become something larger than himself. More friends visited over the following weeks. Each reunion carried its own emotional weight. People who'd mourned James, who'd moved on with their grief, now had to recalibrate their reality. Some handled it well, Others struggled with a kind of cognitive dissonance that made conversations awkward. One visitor stood out. Sarah Chen had been James's colleague at the architecture firm where he'd worked before his death. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, her professional demeanor barely concealing deep emotion. "We archived all your projects," she said, accepting the tea Helen offered. "Transferred your clients, packed up your office. I even wrote your memorial for the company newsletter." She laughed, but it sounded broken. "I don't know how to undo those things, how to explain to everyone that you're back." "You don't have to explain anything," James said. "I'm still processing it myself." Sarah studied him carefully. "You look different. Thinner, obviously, but something else. Your eyes?" James nodded slowly. "I saw something down there. Not heaven or hell or anything religious, just perspective. About what matters and what doesn't. Turns out most of what I stressed about before doesn't actually matter at all." "And what does matter?" James's hand dropped to Duke's head. "This. Connection. Being present with the people and animals we love. Everything else is just noise." Sarah stayed for hours, talking about work, but also about life, loss, and the strange gift of second chances. When she left, she hugged James tightly and whispered, "Don't disappear again, okay? Once was enough." The turning point came on day 68 after the rescue. James woke up that morning with something he'd been missing since emerging from the ground. Appetite. Real appetite, not the forced nutrition his body needed, but actual hunger. "I want bacon," he announced to Helen's surprise, "and eggs, and toast with too much butter. Everything greasy and terrible and delicious." Helen laughed, the sound carrying relief she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I think we can arrange that." They ate together at the kitchen table, Duke stationed between them hopefully. James ate slowly, his stomach still adjusting to normal food, but his enjoyment was genuine. "I've been thinking," he said between bites, "about Duke, about how everyone's calling him a hero." "He is a hero." "Sure, but that's not how he sees it. To him, he was just being a dog, being loyal. It's what dogs do. We're the ones who made it into something extraordinary because we've forgotten that kind of devotion is actually normal for them. We're just not usually worthy of it." Helen considered this. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to live up to it. To be people Duke's loyalty makes sense for. Not perfect, but present. Committed. All in, the way he was." It was the most James had said about his philosophy since returning, and Helen understood it was his way of processing trauma, by making meaning from it, by choosing to let it change him for the better. That afternoon, they took Duke to the park, for the first time since the rescue. It was a simple outing, nothing dramatic. Duke sniffed around, chased a few squirrels half-heartedly, and eventually settled in the shade while James and Helen sat on a bench. But Helen noticed something different. Other dog owners approached them, not to gawk or ask questions, but simply to let their dogs greet Duke. As if recognizing something special, some mark of character that transcended normal pet interactions. One elderly woman with a small terrier sat beside Helen while the dogs touched noses. "That's him, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "The dog from the news?" Helen nodded, prepared to politely decline conversation. But the woman just smiled. "My husband died 3 years ago. Our dog Benny refused to eat for a week, wouldn't leave his side of the bed. Everyone said I was projecting, that dogs don't really grieve like that, but I knew better. And when I saw your story, I thought, finally. Finally people understand what we've always known, that they love us just as deeply as we love them." She stood to leave, but paused. "Thank you for not giving up on him, for trusting what he knew." These interactions became common. People sharing their own stories of pet devotion, animal intuition, bonds that defied explanation. Duke had become a symbol, and while James worried about the pressure of that, Helen thought maybe it was okay. Maybe people needed symbols sometimes, reminders of loyalty in an age of disposability. The 3-month anniversary of the rescue arrived quietly. No media coverage, no fanfare. Just Helen, James, and Duke returning to Riverside Cemetery for the first time since that impossible night. Frank the groundskeeper met them at the gate. "Thought you might come today," he said. "I've been maintaining the site. People leave flowers sometimes, notes. It's become something of a landmark." They walked together to James's grave. The grass had grown back over the excavation site, new and green. Someone had placed a small granite marker beside the headstone. It read simply, "Where faith waited, where love won." Duke sniffed around the area with casual interest, no longer obsessed or driven. It was just ground now, just grass. The presence he'd sensed was standing right beside him, whole and alive. James knelt, running his fingers over his own headstone. His name, his dates of birth and death. Except the death date was wrong now. A lie carved in stone. "Should we have it removed?" Helen asked. "No, leave it. It's a reminder." "Of what?" "That death isn't always the end, and sometimes the most impossible thing is just the beginning of a different story." They sat for a while, the three of them comfortable in silence. Helen thought about those 4 months, the hardest of her life. The grief, the cold, the slowly fading hope. And yet, if given the chance to change any of it, she wouldn't. Because it had led here, to this moment, to understanding that love was measurable not in comfort, but in commitment. On the drive home, Duke fell asleep in the back seat, his body finally fully relaxed. Helen glanced at him in the rearview mirror and smiled. "He's different now," she observed. "How so?" James asked. "Lighter, like he'd been carrying something, heavy, and finally put it down." James reached back to rest his hand on Duke's side. He earned his rest, and then some. That night, for the first time since the rescue, Duke chose to sleep in his old spot in the living room rather than beside James's bed. It was a small thing, but significant. Trust restored. Vigil ended. Helen found James standing in the doorway of the living room, watching Duke sleep. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Yeah, just thinking about how close we came to losing each other. If the casket had been sealed better, if Duke had given up even 1 day earlier, if you hadn't been there that night." He shook his head. So many impossible variables that all had to align perfectly. Maybe it wasn't variables. Maybe it was just meant to be. James smiled. "You sound like the people calling it a miracle." Maybe they're right. Later, lying in her own bed, Helen reflected on the definition of miracle. She'd always thought of miracles as dramatic, unmistakable interventions. Seas parting, dead rising, fire from heaven. But maybe real miracles were quieter. A defective seal letting in just enough air. A dog's instinct sharp enough to detect the impossible. A human stubborn enough to wait in the cold with him. Maybe miracles were just love refusing to accept defeat. The next morning brought unexpected news. Dr. Harrison called with results from James's latest tests. His kidney function had returned to near normal levels. His heart showed no signs of damage. Cognitively, he tested perfectly. By all medical standards, James Parker shouldn't just be alive, he should be permanently damaged. Instead, he was healing completely. "I don't have an explanation," Dr. Harrison admitted when they met in his office. "Your recovery defies every prognostic model. It's as if your body went into preservation mode and somehow protected all your vital systems. Like a bear hibernating? James suggested. Similar, but even bears show deterioration during hibernation. You're just getting better, stronger. At this rate, you'll be fully cleared for normal activity within 2 months. Helen squeezed James's hand. Another impossible thing in a year of impossibilities. The psychological evaluation took longer. James saw a therapist twice weekly, working through the trauma of his experience. Some sessions left him exhausted and quiet. Others seemed to energize him, as if talking about it helped distribute the weight more evenly. She says I'm processing remarkably well, James told Helen after one session, given the circumstances. But she also says to expect setbacks. That trauma doesn't heal linearly. How do you feel? James considered this. Grateful, mostly. I know that's weird, to be grateful for something so terrible. But I got to see how much I matter to people, how much Duke loves me, how you stayed even when it seemed hopeless. Most people don't get that kind of clarity until it's too late. I got it and survived. As fall turned toward winter, life began to find its new rhythm. James started working from home, doing freelance architecture projects that didn't demand full-time presence. Helen returned to her job, though with more flexible hours. Duke seemed content to be a normal dog again, his brief fame settling into comfortable routine. But there were moments, small ones, where the extraordinary nature of their bond showed through. The way Duke would sometimes stop mid-play and simply stare at James, as if confirming he was still there. The way James would wake from nightmares to find Duke already awake, pressed against him before the first cry escaped. They'd been through something together that rewrote the rules of what was possible. And that kind of shared experience didn't fade, it integrated, became part of who they were. On Christmas Eve, 6 months after the rescue, they hosted a small gathering. Marcus drove in again, bringing his new girlfriend. Sarah from the architecture firm came with her family. Dr. Brennan stopped by with homemade cookies. Even Frank the groundskeeper made an appearance, bearing a bottle of whiskey and stories about the strange things he'd seen in 40 years of cemetery work. Nothing like this, though, he insisted, gesturing at James. This takes the cake. They ate, laughed, shared stories, and when someone proposed a toast to miracles, everyone raised their glasses, including Duke, who was offered a small dish of gravy for the occasion. To impossible things, James said, his arm around Helen, his free hand resting on Duke's head, and to the love that makes them possible. Later, after everyone had left and the house had quieted, Helen found James and Duke sitting on the back porch, despite the cold. She wrapped a blanket around James's shoulders and sat beside him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how many dogs are out there right now, showing devotion just like Duke did. Maybe not in such dramatic circumstances, but just as real. And how most people take it for granted. How we took it for granted." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to forget what Duke taught me. That love isn't convenient or comfortable. It's committed, all in, no matter what." "You're not going to forget?" "How do you know?" Helen gestured at Duke, who sat between them watching snowflakes drift down from the dark sky. "Because he won't let you. That's what guardians do. They don't just save you once. They keep saving you every day by reminding you what matters." James smiled and pulled the blanket tighter around all three of them. In the distance, church bells rang, marking midnight. Christmas had arrived. But for James Parker, every day since November 24th had been Christmas. A gift he didn't deserve, but would spend the rest of his life honoring. And Duke, faithful Duke, simply sat and watched the snow. His vigil was over, but his duty never would be. Because love, true love, doesn't end when the crisis passes. It just evolves into something quieter, but no less profound. The watch continues, always. The new year arrived with a clarity James had never experienced before. Everything looked different through eyes that had seen darkness absolute. The morning light through kitchen windows felt like a gift. The sound of Helen's laughter carried weight and meaning. Even mundane frustrations, traffic or a broken dishwasher, couldn't penetrate the gratitude that had become his baseline emotion. But the world outside their small bubble continued to demand attention. The story refused to fade. A major television network offered a prime-time special. A best-selling author wanted to write their story. James declined them all, but he couldn't stop people from talking, speculating, building narratives around what had happened. Some of those narratives bothered him more than others. The religious interpretations felt presumptuous. The conspiracy theories suggesting he'd faked his death made him angry in ways that surprised him. But worst were the people who tried to explain away Duke's devotion as simple instinct, nothing more than biological programming. "They don't understand," he told Helen one evening, watching news coverage that reduced Duke to an animal acting on pack instincts. It wasn't instinct, it was choice. Every day Duke chose to stay. That's what makes it extraordinary. Helen agreed, but she also understood what James didn't quite grasp yet. People needed to rationalize the inexplicable, to fit miracles into frameworks they could understand. It wasn't personal. It was human nature trying to process something that transcended nature. The real test came in February, when James was finally cleared to return to normal activity. His doctors remained cautiously optimistic, monitoring him closely for any delayed effects. But his body had somehow reset itself, emerging from its catatonic state stronger and more resilient than before. "I want to start running again," James announced one morning. Helen looked up from her coffee. "Are you sure you're ready?" "Dr. Harrison says physically, yes. And mentally, I need to prove to myself that my body works, that I'm not still buried." They started small, short jogs around the block with Duke running between them. The first few attempts left James winded and frustrated, his endurance depleted by months of immobility. But gradually, strength returned. By the end of February, they were running 3 miles at a time, Duke setting the pace, his tail wagging with joy at having his human back in full function. It was on one of these runs that they encountered Mrs. Fletcher, an elderly woman who'd been leaving flowers at the cemetery during Duke's vigil. She stood at the end of her driveway, her walker positioned carefully on the sidewalk, watching them approach with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said as they slowed to a walk. I needed to see for myself that it was real. That you were really alive." James stopped, breathing hard. "It's real." "I lost my husband 2 years ago," Mrs. Fletcher continued. "Our dog Benny died 3 months later. Everyone said it was just timing, just coincidence. But I knew better. He died of a broken heart. And when I heard about Duke, about how he waited, I thought, there's proof. They love us just as much as we love them." Her voice broke. "And then to find out he was right, that you were still there. It's like the universe finally gave us evidence of what we've always known but could never prove." James knelt so he was eye level with her. "Duke proved it, and Benny proved it too. Just because your husband wasn't still alive didn't make Benny's grief less real, or his love less powerful." Mrs. Fletcher touched James's shoulder with a trembling hand. "Thank you for saying that." They parted with a promise that Mrs. Fletcher could visit Duke any time, an offer she took up the following week and many weeks after. She'd sit in their living room, drinking tea and telling stories about Benny, while Duke rested his head in her lap, seeming to understand that she needed this connection. March brought unexpected consequences. The cemetery board, dealing with an influx of visitors and requests to memorialize pets at grave sites, instituted new rules. No unattended animals on cemetery grounds. It was clearly a reaction to Duke's vigil, and it infuriated Helen. "They're punishing people for what Duke did," she said, pacing their kitchen. "Punishing grief for being too visible." But James took a different view. Maybe they're protecting the next Duke. If someone else's dog does what Duke did, they'll die. Because most people aren't in catatonic states. Most people are actually dead. The rule is harsh, but it might save animals from destroying themselves over graves. It was a pragmatic perspective that didn't make Helen feel better, but she couldn't argue the logic. Sometimes miracles were unrepeatable. Sometimes protecting others meant acknowledging that Duke's loyalty, while beautiful, could be lethal if replicated under normal circumstances. The therapy sessions evolved as James healed. His therapist, Dr. Nakamura, had specialized in trauma, but admitted James's case was unprecedented. They worked through standard PTSD protocols, but had to develop new approaches for anxiety that stemmed from being buried alive and rescued miraculously. "I'm afraid of going back," James admitted during one session. "Not to the cemetery, that's fine, but back to being normal. What if normal means forgetting? What if I lose the clarity I have now?" Dr. Nakamura leaned forward. "That's a common fear for people who've had profound experiences. They're afraid that healing means losing the wisdom they gained through suffering. But here's the truth. You won't forget. The experience is integrated into who you are now. You can be healthy and still carry its lessons." "How do I make sure?" "You live them every day. You make choices based on the values the experience clarified. You honor Duke's loyalty by being someone worthy of it. That's not about maintaining trauma. That's about allowing trauma to inform growth." It was exactly what James needed to hear. He started making changes, concrete ones. He volunteered at an animal shelter, working specifically with dogs deemed difficult or unadoptable. He gave talks at schools about pet responsibility and the depth of animal consciousness. He wrote an essay, his first public statement about the experience, that focused not on his survival, but on Duke's unwavering faith. The essay went viral, shared millions of times. It resonated because James wrote honestly about his own failures as a pet owner before the incident, how he'd sometimes treated Duke as an accessory rather than a family member, how he'd taken the dog's love for granted. "We think we're doing them a favor by rescuing them," he wrote, "but the truth is more complicated. They rescue us right back. They teach us about commitment, presence, unconditional love. Duke didn't save my life just by waiting at that grave. He saved it by showing me what it means to truly show up for someone, no matter the cost." The response was overwhelming. People wrote about their own pets, their own failures and redemptions. Animal shelters reported increased adoptions. The conversation shifted from the sensational aspects of James's story to the deeper truth it revealed about human-animal bonds. But not everyone responded positively. Critics emerged, particularly in religious communities that felt the story gave too much moral weight to animals. Some argued that Duke's loyalty, while touching, was being elevated to a spiritual level that was inappropriate. James tried to ignore these voices, but one opinion piece in a national newspaper particularly stung. It accused him of exploiting Duke, of building a cult of personality around an animal acting on instinct, and of promoting sentimentality over faith. "Don't read the comments," Helen warned, but James couldn't help himself. The cruelty surprised him. People who'd never met Duke, who hadn't spent 4 months watching his vigil, felt qualified to dismiss his devotion as meaningless. People who hadn't lain in darkness, sustained only by the distant sense of a dog's presence, could reduce it all to biology and dismiss the miracle as coincidence. "Let it go," Marcus advised during a phone call. "You can't control how people interpret your story. Some will get it, some won't. Focus on the ones who do." Sound advice, but hard to follow. James found himself composing responses in his head, crafting arguments to defend Duke's honor. It took Dr. Nakamura to point out what he was really defending. "It's not Duke's loyalty you're protecting," she observed. "It's the meaning you've assigned to it. If Duke was just following instinct, then your survival was just chance. But if Duke made a choice, if his devotion was real and intentional, then your survival means something. You matter. Your bond mattered enough to bend reality." James sat with that for a long time. "So I need the story to be miraculous." "No, you need it to be meaningful. And it is meaningful, regardless of how others interpret it. The question is, can you hold on to that meaning without needing everyone else to validate it?" It was hard work, learning to let the story exist without controlling its interpretation. But gradually, James found peace. He stopped reading articles about himself, stopped engaging with critics. He focused instead on the people who reached out privately, sharing their own stories of animal devotion, their own experiences of love that transcended explanation. Spring arrived with a gentleness that felt earned. The trees bloomed, the world turning green and alive. Duke's coat thickened and shone with health. James's nightmares decreased to once or twice a month. Life, impossibly, was becoming normal again. On April 15th, the one-year anniversary of James's funeral, they returned to Riverside Cemetery as a family. The grave looked peaceful, the grass long since grown over. Someone had left a fresh bouquet of daisies at the marker. "People still visit," Frank told them. "Not as many as before, but steady. Usually folks going through their own grief. I think Duke's story gives them comfort." They sat together on the grass, James between Helen and Duke, all three watching clouds drift across a perfect blue sky. "A year ago I was dead," James said quietly. "Or everyone thought I was. And Duke sat right here, refusing to believe it." "Are you glad he did?" Helen asked. "Even knowing how much he suffered?" James thought about this carefully. "That's the wrong question. I'm glad I survived, obviously. But I'd give anything to undo Duke's suffering. The fact that both things are connected, that one required the other, it's complicated. It's not a clean story about how suffering leads to good things. It's messy and painful and miraculous all at once." Helen nodded. She understood. Life rarely offered clean narratives. The truth was always more complex than the stories people told about it. Duke, for his part, seemed unconcerned with philosophical questions. He rolled onto his back in the grass, tongue lolling, enjoying the spring sunshine. His vigil was over. His human was alive. For a dog, that was enough. Later that week, James made a decision he'd been considering for months. He contacted a sculptor, a local artist who worked in bronze, and commissioned a piece. Not of himself, but of Duke. Duke as he'd been during the vigil, lying alert, ears forward, eyes watching, faithful. "Where will you put it?" the sculptor asked. "Here," James said, gesturing at his grave. "So people know. So the story isn't just about me surviving. It's about a dog who believed in something everyone else called impossible." The sculpture was installed in June. A life-sized bronze Duke, positioned as if lying in eternal watch. The plaque beneath read simply, "Duke, loyalty incarnate. He waited 117 days. The cemetery board approved it unanimously. Even they understood that some stories needed permanent remembering. Summer brought changes. Helen accepted a promotion that required more travel. James took on a major project designing a community center for a non-profit. Duke, now almost 5 years old, settled into the calm dignity of a dog who'd accomplished his life's purpose and could finally just be. But the bond between James and Duke remained extraordinary. James could sense Duke's moods with precision that surprised him. He'd know when Duke needed exercise, when he needed quiet, when something had upset him, And Duke, in turn, seemed to anticipate James's needs before James himself recognized them. "You two are like an old married couple," Marcus joked during a visit. "Better than that," James replied. "Married couples sometimes grow apart. Duke and I were permanently bonded, like we went through something that fused us at a molecular level." Dr. Brennan, when James mentioned this to her, nodded knowingly. "That's not metaphorical. Shared trauma, especially survival trauma, creates lasting neurological changes. You're literally wired to attune to each other now. It's similar to what we see in combat soldiers or survivors of disasters. Except this was just the two of you, which makes the bond even more concentrated." "So it's science?" "Science explains the how. It doesn't diminish the what. You and Duke share something profound because you needed each other to survive. That's both biological and beautiful." As fall returned, marking 18 months since the rescue, life had achieved something James never expected: normalcy. Not the oblivious normalcy of before, but a conscious, chosen normalcy. A decision to live fully, despite knowing how fragile life truly was. He woke each morning beside Duke, whose presence had become as necessary as breathing. He worked on projects that mattered, spent time with people he loved, said yes to experiences that enriched rather than just distracted. "You're different," Helen observed one evening. "Not just recovered, actually different." "How so?" "Present. Before, even when you were with people, you were half somewhere else. Planning, worrying, distracted. Now you're here, fully here." James smiled. "Death does that to you. Or near death. You stop saving your attention for something more important because you realize there's nothing more important than now." On the 2-year anniversary, they didn't return to the cemetery. Instead, they went to the shelter where James had found Duke 3 years ago. They walked through the rows of kennels, past dogs barking for attention, dogs hiding in corners, dogs who'd given up hope. And James made a decision. "We're taking one home," he told the shelter director. Helen's eyes widened. "James, I know what you're going to say. Duke doesn't need a companion. We don't need the complication. But look at these dogs. They need someone who understands what Duke understood, that sometimes waiting is enough, that sometimes just showing up every day is what saves a life." They chose a senior dog, a mixed breed with graying fur and sad eyes. The shelter called her Daisy, which felt appropriate given the flowers that had marked both Duke's vigil and the sculpture. Duke, when he met Daisy in the shelter's introduction area, did something remarkable. He walked directly to her, touched his nose to hers, then lay down beside her. As if to say, "I understand. Whatever you've been through, I understand." Daisy's tail wagged for the first time in months. And so their family grew. 2 dogs and 2 humans, all of them rescued in one way or another, all of them understanding that family was what you chose to create from the pieces life handed you. The following months were challenging. Daisy had trauma issues that required patience and consistency. She flinched at loud noises, avoided men other than James, and sometimes woke from nightmares that echoed James's own. But gradually, with Duke's gentle presence and Helen's steady care, she began to heal. "She reminds me of Duke after the rescue," Helen said one evening, watching Daisy finally relax enough to sleep deeply. "So damaged, but fighting to trust again." James nodded. "Except Duke had purpose during his worst moments. He was waiting for me. Daisy's just been waiting for anything to make sense again. Maybe that's what we can give her, a place where things make sense." By the 3rd-year anniversary, Daisy had transformed. She still carried scars, both literal and emotional, but she'd become part of their rhythm. She and Duke had developed their own relationship, quiet and supportive, 2 souls who'd known suffering and found peace together. The media had moved on completely. New stories, new miracles, new viral moments had replaced them. James was grateful. Fame had always been uncomfortable, a byproduct he'd never sought. The real gift was what remained after the spotlight moved. A life rebuilt with intention. He'd learned from Duke that loyalty wasn't dramatic gestures but daily choices. That love was measured not in moments but in the steady accumulation of presence. That sometimes the most profound act was simply refusing to abandon someone, even when abandoning them would be easier. "I'm writing a book," James told Helen one autumn evening. "Not about the rescue, about everything that came after, about how you rebuild a life once you've seen it end. Will Duke be in it?" "Duke is it. The whole thing is about learning to be someone a dog like Duke would wait for. About earning that kind of devotion by becoming that devoted yourself." The book took 2 years to write. It wasn't a quick project designed to capitalize on fading fame. It was careful, thoughtful, honest about failures and struggles. James wrote about the nightmares that never completely stopped. About survivor's guilt. About the marriage of friend who'd moved on after his death and struggled to adjust to his return. About the strange grief of mourning a life you didn't actually lose, but can never quite reclaim. And through it all, he wrote about Duke. Not as a plot device or symbol, but as a real dog with preferences and quirks and a stubbornness that had saved 2 lives, James's and his own. Because by refusing to give up on James, Duke had given himself purpose enough to survive the unsurvivable. The book published 5 years after the rescue. It sold modestly but meaningfully, finding its way to people going through their own impossible situations. James received letters from hospice workers, soldiers dealing with PTSD, parents of missing children, people who needed to believe that waiting wasn't foolish, that hope wasn't naive, that sometimes faith in something impossible was actually the most reasonable response. One letter came from a woman whose husband had been in a coma for 8 months. Doctors recommended removing life support. Family agreed it was time, but she couldn't do it. Not yet. She wrote, "Your story gave me permission to wait a little longer, to trust my gut. 2 weeks after I read it, he woke up. They called it impossible, but Duke waited 117 days. I could wait another 2 weeks." James kept that letter framed in his office. Proof that their story rippled outward in ways he couldn't predict or control. That Duke's vigil had become something larger than itself. Permission for others to believe in their own impossible things. Duke himself aged gracefully. By year 7, his muzzle had gone completely gray and his pace on walks had slowed. But his eyes remained bright, his devotion unwavering. He'd lived his purpose and was content in the aftermath. James watched him sleep one evening and realized something profound. Duke's great act wasn't the waiting itself. It was the choice to believe in James's return, even when every rational indicator said it was impossible. That kind of faith, that willingness to be proven a fool if it meant honoring love, was the real miracle. "I want to be more like Duke," James told Dr. Nakamura in one of their final sessions. "Not dramatic heroic, just consistently present, reliably loyal, willing to look stupid if it means not abandoning someone who needs me." "That's a good goal," she replied. "Not easy, but good. None of the best things are easy." 8 years after the rescue, Duke began to slow down noticeably. His hips bothered him. He slept more. The vet prepared them gently for what was inevitable. "He's had a remarkable life," Dr. Brennan said, "and a few extra years thanks to his own stubborn survival. But eventually, nature has its way." They made Duke comfortable, filling his final months with everything he loved. Long car rides with windows down, bacon treats, hours lying in patches of sunlight, visits from the shelter, dogs they'd helped over the years, a parade of grateful animals who owed their lives to James and Helen's expanding compassion. On a quiet Tuesday in October, Duke didn't wake up. He'd gone to sleep the night before, curled against James's leg, and sometime in the darkness, he'd simply stopped breathing. Peaceful. Complete. James woke to find him still and knew immediately. No veterinary examination needed. Duke's purpose was fulfilled. His story was finished. They buried him not in Riverside Cemetery, where James's own grave still stood with its bronze memorial, but in their backyard beneath the oak tree Duke had loved, a private resting place for a dog whose public heroism was only a fraction of his private faithfulness. The funeral was small. Helen, James, Marcus, Sarah, Dr. Brennan, Frank from the cemetery. They shared stories not of the vigil, but of the years after. Duke teaching Daisy to trust again. Duke knowing when James needed comfort before James himself realized it. Duke living every single day as if it were gift enough just to be there. "He taught me what it means to show up," James said, his voice thick. "Every day, rain or shine, convenient or not. He just showed up. That's all any of us can do. Just keep showing up for the people and animals we love." Later, alone in the yard, James stood at the fresh grave. Daisy sat beside him, her head resting against his leg in a gesture inherited from Duke. "Thank you," James whispered, "for waiting, for believing, for saving me in more ways than you knew." The wind moved through the oak's branches, carrying leaves that drifted down like gentle rain. And James swore he felt something, a presence, a reassurance. Not Duke's ghost, he wasn't superstitious, just the accumulated weight of 8 years of devotion settling into memory, becoming permanent. Duke's watch was over. But the lessons of that watch would echo through every day James had left, through every choice to stay when leaving would be easier, through every moment of showing up fully for the people who mattered. Life continued. James and Helen adopted 2 more senior dogs. The book found new readers. The Bronze Duke in Riverside Cemetery became a pilgrimage site for pet lovers worldwide. James aged into his 50s, then 60s, carrying his impossible story more lightly with each passing year. And sometimes, late at night, he'd dream of Duke. Not the Duke of the vigil, broken and suffering, but Duke as he'd been in those final years, content, fulfilled, at peace. They'd walk together through landscapes that existed only in sleep, and James would feel again the certainty of being truly seen, truly known, truly loved by a soul who'd waited 117 days to prove it. The watch was over, but the love never ended. And that, James understood in his bones, was the whole point.